I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we discuss the new wave of bombardments in Kyiv, the latest appointments to the Trump administration and what it could mean for the wider West, and learn more about Radio Liberty's impact during the Cold War.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 13th of November, 2 years and 269 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and author Julian Evans, who's just written a new book on the Ukrainian port city of Odessa, somewhere he's known intimately for over 30 years. But first, over to Dom for the latest news from the battlefield.
Well, hi Francis, hi everybody. Let's start in Ukraine. And a Russian Navy officer was killed this morning in a car bombing in Sevastopol in Crimea. A source in the SBU, that's the security service of Ukraine, told the Kyiv Independent that Captain Valery Trankovsky had been targeted specifically by the agency, by the SBU. Trankovsky was Chief of Staff of the 41st Missile Boat Brigade, and the SBU said, quote, a war criminal who has ordered cruise missile launches from the Black Sea against civilian sites in Ukraine. We've seen a few of these, particularly in Crimea and the other occupied areas down south, particularly around Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. Not seen for a while, but these close quarter assassinations, as they're known, CQAs, there have been a few. Now then, sticking in Ukraine. Russia attacked Kyiv with air-launched cruise missiles, Iskander-M or North Korean KN-23-24 variant ballistic missiles, and drones overnight. The Air Force said 2 KH-101 cruise missiles and 2 of the Iskanders or the North Korean ballistic missiles, and 37 of 90 drones were downed over the Kyiv, Poltava and Zhytomyr areas. That's Kyiv just to the west, and then Zhytomyr is over halfway between Kyiv and Kharkiv. 47 other drones were lost across Ukraine. We think, as I've said before, we interpret that as being brought down by electronic warfare. And 2 flew back to, one to Belarus and 1 to Russia. Ukrainian officials fear today's attack on the capital could be the start of a new wave of attacks ahead of what's expected to be a harsh winter featuring numerous energy blackouts. Andrei Kovalenko, a senior official at the National Security and Defence Council, warned that Russia was ready to conduct another massive attack, in his words, and had accumulated a large number of cruise missiles. So Kyiv and the country in general has been getting whacked with drones a huge amount recently, but their missiles and ballistic missiles have not been such a feature in recent weeks. That may be changing. Now, the Kyiv City Military Administration said power shortages may be introduced as a preventative measure if Russia continues to attack energy infrastructure. Elsewhere, around the fronts up in Russia, no sign of this expected Russian counterattack in Kursk yet. No changes to the lines up there. In Ukraine, in the northeast, Kupiansk is coming under increased pressure. We mentioned it a few times recently. Russian forces have recently advanced there a bit to the north and south. They are thought to be about 5 kilometres north and about 15 kilometres south of Kupiansk. Then in the Donbass, very minor advances, next to nothing on the northern bank of the Vovcha reservoir. No sign that the dam has been destroyed or has burst in any way, as we reported yesterday, but very, very little movement there. Now then, outside the country, let's go to the US. The US has delivered 83% of munitions, 67% of the air defences and 60% of firepower capabilities committed to Ukraine under the various defence packages between April and mid-October this year. That came from Pentagon spokesperson Major General Pat Ryder yesterday. He added that approximately $7 billion remains for further support and stressed the US would continue supplying Ukraine regardless of political developments, a nod obviously to the incoming Trump administration, and concerns the flow of aid will not only dwindle, but that the existing pledges may not be followed through. Now, staying in the Pentagon, and another spokesperson, Vinay Patel, said, this was yesterday, said, "Today I can confirm that over 10,000 North Korean soldiers have been sent to eastern Russia, and most of them have moved to the far western Kursk Oblast, where they have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces." I think it means on the side of Russian forces, not. He continued, "Russian forces have trained the North Korean soldiers in artillery, in UAV, that's uninhabited or unmanned air vehicles, drones, UAV and basic infantry operations, including trench clearing, which are critical skills for frontline operations." So we thought that. Pentagon have said before that they're in combat, but we're just giving you the details as we get them, just keeping an eye on this development. I still find it amazing that we've got North Korean soldiers fighting in Europe, Iranian ballistic missiles landing in Europe, Chinese technology being used in weapons in Europe, and European leaders and defence chiefs, if they're doing anything, they're saying the right things, but there's not an awful lot of action, guys. It's North Koreans in Europe fighting. Anyway, now, finally for me, let's nip over to Brussels, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said this morning the Biden administration plans to increase US military assistance to Ukraine in the final months of its term. Mr. Blinken met several officials, including new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and said the outgoing administration would, quote, "continue to shore up everything we're doing for Ukraine," unquote, "to ensure it can either fight effectively next year or negotiate peace with Russia from a position of strength." This reporting comes from the Kyiv Independent. Mr. Blinken then said, "We will continue to shore up everything we're doing for Ukraine to ensure it can effectively defend itself. President Biden fully intends to drive through the tape and use every remaining day to further strengthen this alliance." Okay. Mr. Blinken also issued a stern warning regarding North Korea's deployment of troops, saying this demands and will receive a firm response. Okay, as I said, all good words, all the right words, but I just wonder if he's going through the motions, how much life there is left in this administration, and whether or not they really want to do anything. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. From one administration then to the next. One of the most interesting and telling things about the incoming Trump administration is that it is seemingly still in campaign mode, with the president-elect releasing huge videos every day that announce appointments and policies. Yesterday, after our broadcast, we learned that billionaire Elon Musk and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy will lead a new Department of Government Efficiency, whilst, most significantly for Ukraine, Fox host and veteran Pete Hegseth will become the incoming US Defense Secretary, replacing Lloyd Austin. Trump wrote on social media, "Pete has spent his entire life as a warrior for the troops and for the country. He's tough, smart, and a true believer in America first. With Pete at the helm, America's enemies are on notice. Our military will be great again, and America will never back down." Now, Hegseth, he's 44. He has no previous military leadership experience, but served as an Army National Guard infantry captain with tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was formerly head of the conservative group Concerned Veterans for America and ran unsuccessfully for the Senate in Minnesota in 2012, and until recently co-hosted Fox and Friends Weekend, where Trump was a frequent caller. Now, his nomination has shocked defence officials and experts alike, with several sources voicing surprise at appointing a media personality as Defence Secretary. There's hope for you yet, Dom. But on specific policy stances, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he made waves for downplaying Russia's invasion and suggested it was less pressing than issues like wokeness in American culture. He's also echoed Trump's criticisms of NATO, questioning why the US should honour one-sided defence commitments. But, and I think this is important, fundamentally he comes across as somebody who is loyal to Trump. So it will be the president himself, I would wager, that will dictate policy, which is why whatever previous statements Trump's foreign policy team have said in the past, we should be cautious about reading too much into them. Above all, Trump expects loyalty, and those who don't fulfill it are out. Now, interestingly, a Republican foreign policy expert told Politico, and I quote, that Kyiv is quite calm and quite comfortable with the national security officials announced so far. If that's true, perhaps they expected worse and were relieved that something, at least, is going to change rather than the continued agony of the status quo. We don't know anything specific about Trump's peace plan for Ukraine yet, but what we can be sure of is that the burden to keep Ukraine safe and prosperous will ultimately fall on Europeans. That means money, weapons, and potentially troops on the ground, particularly if this 800-mile border is to be manned, as has been mooted. So even if it's not Europe's responsibility to step in to save Ukraine at this point, armament is going to be necessary anyway. That would be one of the prices for Europe of not seeking a defeat for Russia in Ukraine. Increased defence spending to finance maintaining the peace. And some might wonder whether ultimately it would have been cheaper to push for outright victory earlier. One for future historians. Now, one other important impact of the Trump victory, as yet underexplored in my view, is on global energy markets. There's an interesting piece in Business Insider that points out how Russia's oil and gas industry could come under greater pressure as domestically Trump is championing the US oil and gas industry and encouraging production, which is likely to underscore America's position as a premier oil and gas giant. Meanwhile, we've got the EU saying that it would consider buying more US liquefied natural gas in a deal with Trump that could address a trade deficit. Now, long-time listeners will recall that when we were in Washington, I interviewed Victoria Coates, who's a former Deputy National Security Advisor to the Trump administration, first time round, who later transferred to the Department of Energy to advise on national security issues. Telling in and of itself. But one of the things she said to me in that interview was that Trump was absolutely committed to making the US an energy exporter, negating some of the power that Middle Eastern countries have and Russia over Western powers. This war could ultimately transform the way energy is bought and sold around the world. So we should keep a very close eye on that, and indeed we will continue to do so. But before we go to our guest, I just want to return to a subject we've been talking about a lot recently, the free flow of information into Russia, and particularly the work of platforms like Radio Liberty during the Cold War and its lessons for today. We've continued to get so many messages from you, and it was an interest to us that it meant when Dom was in Prague, he actually visited the Central European offices of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, as Prague is where they're based. But before I go to Dom about that, I just wanted to read another note from a listener, Cătălin in Romania. She writes, I remember the evenings listening to Radio Free Europe with my mum, the opening bars of Enescu's Romanian Rhapsody No. 1, and then the voices of Monica Lovinescu and Virgil Lorunca, voices speaking beautiful Romanian, educated people who defied communism and cherished freedom. That's where we got our news, where the light came from, through a Salina radio, ironically, a Russian one. Behind the Iron Curtain, it was through that source that we first heard King Michael I of Romania, where I learned about the events in December 1989. We tuned into Radio Free Europe, Voice of America and the BBC. They're what sparked my love for freedom and for the culture of the West. I hope this war ends soon, that Ukraine wins, and that after 2 years of a pandemic and 2, soon to be 3 years of war, people can finally live their lives in freedom once again. So thank you very much for writing that. But Dom, I wonder if you could just provide a little bit more about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and your experience in Prague.
Yeah, it was. Thanks, Francis. So, a few people have been asking me, so if I can just sort of go back a step. So, Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty, funded by the American government, international media organisation broadcasting news, analysis, etc., to Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Middle East. Radio Free Europe was founded in 1949. Radio Liberty followed a couple of years later. And throughout the Cold War, Radio Free Europe was aimed broadcasted mainly to Soviet satellite states. And then when Radio Liberty came along, that was broadcasting or aimed into the Soviet Union itself. So the two merged in 1976, which is why they're now RFE/RL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Bit clunky, but that's what it is. And it's kept going. It was listed as an undesirable organisation by Russia in 2024, so they had to get out of the country. They've their headquarters in Washington, but they got their sort of operational headquarters is in Prague. So as I was over there and a bit earlier than I'd expected, because British Airways cancelled my flight and I had to get an earlier one, I thought I would make best use of the time, and I had a chat with some of the guys, and I popped down to go and say hello. Getting in wasn't that easy. Had to all sorts of passport checks and press ID checks and inside leg measurements and all that kind of jazz. Had a security guard shouting at me as I was stood on the pavement. I was actually out on the pavement taking a photo of they've got huge, they spell out the word liberty, big. It's an art installation with each letter being about 10 foot tall, and depending which way you're walking towards it, it spells it out in either English or Czech coming the other way. And that was all rather impressive, and so I was stood there taking photos of that, and then the security guard started shouting at me. He said, "This is private property." I said, "I know it's private property. I'm not in there yet. I'm literally on the pavement, on the sidewalk." Anyway, so I eventually did get in. And whilst I was waiting to go into the newsroom, they got a very nice, a very appropriate, very, very sophisticated memorial, very sensitive memorial, the Fallen Journalist Memorial in the main lobby. And on the stone, I'll just read you what it says on the stone. It says, "The freedom to impart, receive and share information is fundamental to every human right. A free press gives people the opportunity to learn about their own communities and the world and make informed decisions. It celebrates human achievement, gives individuals a voice and holds power to account. RFE/RL journalists, often at great personal risk, work to spread knowledge and combat lies to ensure that people, even in the world's most oppressed nations, have access to the truth. This monument honours our fallen colleagues who died because of their dedication to living in truth, irrespective of the costs and their belief in the power of a free press." So yeah, there's a serious bunch. We rely on them a lot. We use them a lot. We cite them accordingly. You hear us referring to them in the news updates that we give. But they are, very professional journalists operating often at great risk. So I went around the newsroom, met quite a few folk from all the different offices, chatting to the guys on the Afghanistan team. We recognise some of the same places in Helmand province and elsewhere. And yeah, it's a very, very, very good organisation, and one that I'm going to speak to them again and hope to do an interview with them, and so they can explain a bit more about their work and highlight it to you good folk. But no, RFE/RL, I don't know what the shorthand is. Do we just call it Radio Free Europe? But anyway, it's a good organisation. Online, obviously, most of the places that they transmit to is online. That's the only way of getting the information in, with all the attendant issues there of having sites blocked and so on and so forth. So a tough call, and they said they often feel like they're just shouting into a void because they get blocked, but they continue to shout, and we will continue to support them. But no, it was good. It was a very good visit. And if I think you can request. I don't think you have to be a journalist to request a tour. Now, they might not take everybody up on it, depending on what the motivation is. But if you're in Prague and British Airways mess your flight up, then if you've got a few hours, it might be worth dropping them a line and seeing if you can go and say hello.
Well, thanks for that, Dom. I also highly recommend the Kafka Museum. But so let's turn now to our guest, Julian Evans, and we're going to do a deeper dive into one of the cities that Julian is extremely intimate with and has just written a new book on, which is, of course, the port city of Odessa, somewhere that's been in the news a lot more recently because of the bombardments that it has experienced in the past week or so. But Julian, as I say, you've written this book, Undefeatable, Odessa in Love and War, and it's more than just a book that looks at the history of Odessa. It's also a memoir about your own 30 years of experience with that city. So you're somebody who has seen its transformations as Ukraine itself has transformed over the past 30 years. But perhaps you could start us off by just talking a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book now.
Again, thank you both for inviting me. And probably I should start by saying that there wasn't originally going to be a book. I first went to Odessa in 1994, 30 years ago, and then in 2000, having been there a couple of times more, I met a woman from Odessa. I got married in Odessa. And I lived in Odessa for a while and then had a couple of children. We spent all our summers in Odessa. And so it was more of a family chronicle than anything that could really be a book. But then the war began, I mean, the war proper began in 2014, and I felt it was not being reported particularly well in the West. I felt that even respected media organizations like the BBC were really swallowing the Russian line a bit too much, knowing what I knew of the country. And so I decided eventually in 2015 to spend a bit of time on the front line, and I wrote about that. And then, of course, the full-scale invasion started 2.5 years ago, nearly 3 years ago. And I sat in England obsessively looking on and just feeling, I don't know if this explains it properly, but I just felt too safe. I felt I wasn't where I belonged. And so I organised things so that I could go and spend some time in Odessa. And I went and stayed in a hotel in the centre of town for a month in November of that year. And from the moment I arrived in the middle of a blackout just after a missile strike, things started happening which just kept sparking memories of before. And I just thought, all my memories, all of my 30 years of memories are now in danger of elimination, annihilation. And that really brought the war home to me. And so I started to write this book in which, in parallel with talking about what life was like for Odessans and Ukrainians in the face of what was then the pounding of electricity and power installations all across the country, to try and freeze Ukraine into surrender that winter. And in parallel with that, I began to write a memoir about how those current events tied in with the things that had happened to me and how much Odessa had come to mean to me over 30 years. So the book struggled up out of the darkness, and I suppose I just followed my instincts. But I think I'm old enough now to probably trust my instincts a bit better than I did when I was young, and so a book came out, and I had no idea whether it would be publishable, because of course there'd been a welter of very, very, very good books, both by Ukrainians and British writers, reporters, journalists. But I did think that at least writing a personal book about what it was like would provide perhaps a slightly different perspective than just a well-informed historical take on the subject. So I took the risk of making it as personal as I could, and I'm still wondering whether that was the right thing to do. But I feel, again, trusting instincts, I feel it probably was.
Yes, I should fess up and say I've read the book, and I think history is always brought to life by personal experiences like you relay in the text. But for those who aren't experts on the city of Odessa, could you tell us a bit more, please? It's a very unique place with a special history.
Yeah, I think really interesting, energizing things happen at the crossroads. And Odessa is really a crossroads between Europe and, Mediterranean Europe, Western Europe, and what was originally the Russian Empire. It was territory bagged by Catherine the Great in the Russo-Turkish War in 1792, and Odessa was founded in 1794. And thereafter, it was, as a young city, became unexpectedly a hugely booming, self-made city during the 19th century, because it happened to be founded just at the time when the world was becoming urbanized and industrialized. And with that came this huge appetite, population explosion, and a huge appetite for wheat. And Odessa was bang in the middle, bang in the right place, in the middle of the Ukrainian steppe, on the edge of the wheatlands. And so Odessa's fortunes were really triggered and really boomed with the trading, the growing, the exporting of wheat. And that happened all the way through the 19th century. And this, of course, there were some very enlightened early governors to the city who made it very easy for people to come and make money there. So the rest of Europe flocked to it. It became incredibly cosmopolitan. Greeks, Italians, Jews, French, Armenians, Germans, all contributed. The street signs in Odessa through the 19th century were actually in Italian. And you go into old apartment buildings in the city and you will see on the tiled floor it will say "Salve," welcome, in Italian. So extraordinarily cosmopolitan city, very beautiful neoclassical city that, because it was so international, then morphed into later styles like Art Nouveau. And so actually a beautiful city, very easy on the eye. And when I first visited it after 74 years of communist neglect, even though it was falling down, even though it was crumbling, it was still an incredibly beautiful city that, if you half close your eyes and imagined, it ranks certainly with some of the most beautiful cities in Europe.
Thank you. And of course, Odessa will also be somewhere familiar to those listeners interested in the Russian Revolution and the experience of the Russian Civil War. Odessa was a key place of conflict and where many armies basically rallied before trying to oust the Bolsheviks in St. Petersburg and Moscow. But let's talk about this war and Odessa's experience. How would you summarize the last 3 years for the city's citizens?
Yeah, Odessa is, well, for me, it's an emblem of Ukraine. But it has to be said that it's a Russian-speaking city. It's a Russia-leaning city, or has been, with a tremendous amount of importance in earlier Russian culture. There is, at the moment, a big controversy going on between those who want to culturally cleanse the city of its artistic Russian influences, as well as taking down the statue of Catherine the Great. They want to take down the statue to Alexander Pushkin, the poet, and various others, and rename streets and so on, something which I'm completely against. But generally speaking, I think you would find that there it still is, although there have been periods of tension in Odessa's history and extraordinary awful pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century, which prompted a massive wave of emigration. Although there have been those sort of pinch points of tension, Odessans are really very relaxed people. They're very live and let live. Conversations are more likely to start and finish in Ukrainian in the city these days, but the bit of the conversation in the middle is likely still to be in Russian because those people were originally Russian speakers. They have. I rather marvelled at the way they just got up and organised a life for themselves every day after there was yet another missile strike, yet another blackout, and you can stroll around the city and almost not be aware that that is until recently, and almost not be aware that there's a war on. I was there in August, and the beaches were full. People were still coming to holiday to enjoy the warm weather, even though at any moment you might hear the noise of another missile hitting the port. So there's a kind of Odessan insouciance, if you like, about how they cope with these things, and they're more likely to make a joke about Russia's failure to take the city than to become anguished or divided, and so there's I think there's an innate will to survival among Odessans is how I'd put it.
You say that the city citizens were historically Russia-leaning. How has this war changed those attitudes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because to some extent, I think it hasn't changed things among a lot of people. I think a lot of people probably are a little bit baffled and depressed, but they're still supporting Putin. But when I say a lot of people, it just surprises me that not everybody has completely turned away from Russia's blanket aggression. And in fact, you will find that nobody in public at least talks about the war in any other terms than that Ukraine is in the right, Odessa is part of Ukraine, that they now feel far more Ukrainian than they ever did before. And generally, I think it's fair to say that people are learning Ukrainian. They're behaving as if they're Ukrainian. The professional classes are speaking Ukrainian more. And I think people have said to themselves, well, okay, we always felt ourselves to be a state within a state. Odessa was always a city apart in Ukraine. But over the years of the war, that mood and those allegiances have shifted, and they've said, look, we've got our freedom. We are close to Europe. We don't want to go back. We've seen what happens when Russia takes over by its normal tactics of destroy, flatten, and occupy. We have no wish to see that happen in Odessa. And generally speaking, although there's an element of saying, yes, we dislike some of the things Zelensky has done, I think there's a very strong feeling that Odessa is far more part of Ukraine now than it was 3 years ago.
That's very interesting. And just one final question from me before I go to Dom, who I imagine may have a question or two himself. You mentioned that there have been many great books by Ukrainian authors. There are some who would argue that at this moment, it should only be Ukrainian writers who write on Ukrainian culture and cities. But of course, there is a very rich tradition of writers, especially English writers, such as yourself, reflecting on places experiencing war. For example, Norman Lewis, who I know you wrote the biography for. Now, how do you feel about that question, that conundrum, as it were?
Yeah, another really good question. I think writers are often prone to feeling imposter syndrome. I had a very strong dose of it when I realized that this book would be published. And I'm not sure I've completely shaken it off. I did have half a dozen Ukrainian friends read it, and it generally received a seal of approval from them. And interestingly, a seal of approval from them about it as a book written by an outsider who would take something of their message to the world. Because I think at the moment, I have a bit of an advantage writing it in real time, because what Ukrainians are absolutely terrified about is the world forgetting them. And you've done a magnificent job of keeping the message alive, that they aren't forgotten. And one of the reasons for writing this book was that I didn't want the message to die either. I still don't. When I'm not writing, I'm trying to raise funds to send cars and medical equipment to Ukraine too. But more generally, I think that there's a kind of there is, of course, a place for outsiders, and it's not the same place that insiders have. But I think the two can exist symbiotically. And you mentioned Norman Lewis. I also think of Martha Gellhorn's, the American war correspondent's writings about the Second World War, which are absolutely magnificent, and she is respected internationally as a correspondent. But Norman Lewis wrote Naples 44, I think 30 years after the end of the war. And it still took, I think, another decade or two for it to be translated into Italian. But he is now accepted, 50 years on, he's been accepted as a great chronicler of that year of occupation, liberation in Naples. So I'm not holding my breath for a translation of this book into Ukrainian, but I do think that there's a place for outsiders to see the same events, and perhaps to those who are interested and have time to do it within the country, to see a slightly different perspective on their own actions and their own history.
Well, thank you very, very much for that, Julian. A very interesting conundrum, if that's the right way of putting it. But Dom, you've been listening to this. Do you have any questions for Julian?
I do, if I may. Julian, thank you so much. I'm going to read the book after I've swagged Francis's copy. You started off by saying that you felt too safe in London, and you had a draw. You were drawn back to Odessa. Can you just examine that a bit for me, please? Why are you Odessan? Is that what you were feeling, or did it come from a position, dare I say, of Western privilege? You were privileged to be able to feel that. I'm not saying that's an inappropriate emotion. And do you, in your discussions with the Ukrainian diaspora here in the UK and elsewhere, has that resonated with that community?
Yes, I think there's a truth in both of those things that you said. I did feel privileged, and I think at the same time I felt, and I do feel, that this is our story too. That Odessa's story is Ukraine's story, and Ukraine's story is Europe's story. It will willy-nilly become Europe's story more and more the less we do to make sure that Ukraine is victorious and remains free, because empires don't have any borders, and Putin for 15 years has been pushing and pushing at the borders of Russia, and now he's moving in our direction, and nobody knows that better than the easterly nations that were under the Soviet sway during the Cold War, Poland and the Baltic states, for example. So I did feel I had the privilege of being a Western European, and therefore protected by the distance between us. But I also had a feeling that Odessa was where I belonged, and that's I suppose a question of habit, but it's also a question of having fallen in love with the place in the first place. When I first clapped eyes on the Potemkin Stairs and Primorsky Boulevard and the Opera House, it's an incredibly beautiful city, and it's an incredibly open and human and irrepressible city. And yes, I do feel Odessan. I mean, I would say that I would like to, in future, I even have a project at the moment, and why not start thinking about it now, of building a house just outside the city next to the estuary, because I think it would be a very nice place to retire and write.
Thank you. And just one more for me, if I could, Francis. You mentioned there about the character of Odessa. You used words like the insouciance. You said it's irrepressible. Knowing it as you do from your time, years, as you've seen over decades, how close is that insouciance and irrepressible spirit to something a bit darker and a bit less helpful, something like fatalism? Are they still on the right side of that, the character, do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's something that I've come across in my travels in Russia over the last 20, 30 years. But I've very rarely come up against it in Odessa. I think that's to say that probably my view of the city is inevitably an outsider's view, and it may exist. And certainly what you have to factor in, and we haven't really talked about, and we could make a whole program about it, is Odessa as an extraordinarily successful centre of mafia activity for 20 odd years or so. I mean, it was quite funny that my wife Natasha's family, when I met her, it occurred to me that in a way they personified Ukraine in those days, because her father was a well-known wheat scientist, and she had a cousin who was number 2 in the Crimean mafia who came to our wedding. And so, yes, there is certainly a dark side. And I remember the very first time when at our engagement party, somebody turning up rather late and apologising that they'd been shot at by a rival on the way back from 7 Kilometre Market outside the city. So certainly. But there's perhaps to counterbalance that, there's a tremendous amount of humour in the city. There are books and books of Odessa jokes. There's a tremendous amount of art, particularly music. And one of the things that I thought was extraordinarily interesting was that in that wave of emigration after the social tensions at the beginning of the 20th century, you had George Gershwin's father emigrated from Odessa, Serge Gainsbourg's father and grandfather emigrated from Odessa, Bob Dylan's grandparents emigrated from Odessa, and Joe, the French singer, was called Dassin because when his grandfather arrived at Ellis Island, the U.S. immigration official asked him where he was from and misheard him and put down his name as Dassin, as in Odessa. So perhaps there's just a lot of everything in the city, but yes, it's not all sweetness and light, but it's very, very fascinating, endlessly fascinating, and there is no end to the stories that people will tell you.
Well, thank you very much, Julian. Thank you very much, Dom. We'll come back to you in a moment, Julian, for your final thoughts. But Dom, first of all, where do you want to leave our listeners with today?
Thanks, Francis, and thanks, Julian. Just a quickie from me. We've put out a couple of tweets, you'll see. We were delighted and humbled to be shortlisted last night at the Society of Editors Media Freedom Awards. We were listed up for the Podcast of the Year award, and delighted to say that we won. We won Podcast of the Year, and so it was a nice event. This is of all the award ceremonies, this is one of the biggies. This is our peers and our colleagues and what have you in the world of journalism. It was a great event. I made a brief speech when we picked up the award. I can't remember a word of it. I think somebody had spiked my beer by putting water in it, but I couldn't remember an awful lot of what I said. But I think I've made sense. And I was delighted to have Francis to my side when we picked up the award. There was obviously a big gap. David, I dedicated it to him. We were delighted to be able to share the evening with David's parents, and it was just another one on the road. We're getting there, but it was a very nice event, and we wouldn't be there if you weren't there. So thank you to everybody for sticking with us and supporting us and keeping us honest and asking us questions, picking me up on my grammar and my pronunciation of Ukrainian town names and what have you. Every day we try and be a little bit better, and that's we look to you for that, and you've never let us down. So thank you so much. And that award last night was for all of us together, and I include David in that.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, and I echo that too. But Julian, you are our guest, and it's always fitting, as David would want, that you have the final word. What do you want to leave our listeners with today?
That's a very big question. I said that Odessa is really an emblem of Ukraine for me, and I remain very wedded to the idea that we must not forget Ukraine, and that probably, given the uncertainty, let's say, if I can put it like that, some people might express that more strongly, but the uncertainty surrounding America's future attitudes to what's happening in Europe, I think we all need to be pushing our leaders, nudging them, shoving them towards doing more in Europe for Ukraine, because the Ukrainian struggle is our struggle. And I always find it slightly comical when opinion writers say things like they're going to have to give up Crimea. And I think, well, how would you feel about if I said, well, we're going to have to give up Norfolk? It's just not the same when it's your country. And I think the Ukrainians have shown us that they are fantastically heroic. They fought like tigers. And I think it's up to them to decide how they want to honour the sacrifice that their people have made. So I think no negotiations yet. A lot more support would make me very happy.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.